think a lot of people think that the brain's just like a computer, and that's the computer you're given. You can put all sorts of software into it, like our learning and teaching, but the reality is it's not that at all. The brain is constantly remodeling, like all the time, constantly.
He's a neurosurgeon, medical educator, and author.
Gary Simonds.
When you open a brain from a child and from 50, 60-year-old, how do they change over time?
Everything just feels more pristine in a child. In terms of chronic stress, you may not see much difference. More like when you abuse your brain. So chronic alcoholism or long-term cigarettes, anything that really takes a chronic physical toll, the brain will look more shrunken, less viable, if you will. We live in a mile-a-minute society. Everything's going at once. There's a million inputs, and you've got to sort through all this. So we see the way to tackle burnout is to build our personal resilience, really work on our resilience, really work on our wellness. And that's going to fill up the energy stores. So even when you hit bad things, it won't empty you out. But that's hard to do.
Today, I have a special guest, Gary Simonds, and he's a neurosurgeon. He operates brains, and he headed the academic neurosurgery program at Virginia Tech Caroline Clinic, and he has been a professor at the Virginia Tech School of Neuroscience and the Virginia Tech Caroline School of Medicine. He studied biochemistry, and he has performed over 13,500 procedures, and including more than 2.5 pediatric ones, where we will talk about the difference and what are the challenging aspects. He is an author. He wrote various books, and we have so much to talk about today about the connection between brain and the body and neuroplasticity and what you can do to basically train your brain to be more effective. So, Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me and for the lead up.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I obviously did some research before we connected, and you've done so many things, and you have such an intense career in neurosurgery, and now you're retired, you're writing a lot of books. And let's start with your career in neurosurgery. So maybe can you give the audience maybe a little bit of the background, how you ended up being a neurosurgeon? What are the challenges and what are some aspects of your work?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to summarize how you end up or become a neurosurgeon is a lot of blood, sweat, toil, and tears for sure. It's a long, hard road, no two ways about it. I kind of stumbled into it. I was in medical school. I was going to be something totally different as a specialist. And in the last month of medical school, I saw a brain operation and I was hooked. I was like, I have got to do that. And I really I leapt in with both feet, not really understanding how deep the waters were, and they're pretty deep. After medical school, typical neurosurgical training is 7 years, plus or minus another year or two. At least back in those days, it was a good 110 hours a week in the hospital. You pretty much were in the hospital all the time. We were what we would call on call, meaning you took all the emergency and ICU calls and consultations every third night, which meant every third night you didn't even sleep and you just kept working. So
sorry to interrupt. It actually sounds scary to me as a potential patient. I mean, you've been working 100 hours a week, and then I come in and then you need urgent brain operation. So how do you stay focused and how do you stay in the right state that you don't make mistakes and can perform your work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sebastian, that I think we're all still wrestling with is, how do you do this under persistent, prolonged strain and stress, both physical and emotional? One answer is you do. You just do it. It's like so many other hard things in life. Sometimes you just kind of steel your nerves and you focus in and you do it. And of course, in the medical world, I don't know, it's made somewhat easier by the fact that these are people who need you and, they're putting their trust in you. So it felt, even though you could be dog tired, it felt relatively easy to stay on task, to stay at it. But that's part of the problem then is, you're probably pushing yourself beyond where you should be. And particularly, anybody can do that, I think, in short term. But when you do it chronically, I think it begins to be corrosive.
How does a typical brain surgery look like? Or what are typical reasons why people need a surgery?
All sorts of reasons, and they're kind of expanding as time goes on here to one degree or another. Big changes going on in neurosurgery, but principally, they're going to be problems, what we would call structural in nature, meaning, it's big enough that we can see, that we can manipulate, that we can do something to, as opposed to microscopic diseases of the brain. Like multiple sclerosis is a microscopic disease of the brain. It's stripping of the insulation of the nerves, and there's nothing a surgeon can do about that. But a brain tumor, for example, or a clot of blood that's pushing on the brain, or an aneurysm, or severe head injury, these are all things that we may be able to physically go in there and tackle and hopefully make better. And so brain surgery would be with disorders like that, where there's a structure, a problem that we can kind of physically manipulate. That is changing a little. There's a whole branch of neurosurgery, which we call functional neurosurgery, where we're trying to change the function of the brain. And, involves electrical implants, putting in electronics and that sort of thing.
Like what Elon Musk is developing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's there before him, but I'm sure it's going to accelerate. But, if the classic example is Parkinson's, with somebody with very bad Parkinson's symptoms, we can put an electrode deep in the brain in a very precise way. It hooks up to a little battery pack under your skin right here in your chest. And it can really, really improve a lot of those Parkinson's symptoms. Doesn't change the disease. The disease is still there, but the symptoms can be made much better.
When you open a brain from a child and from, say, a 50, 60-year-old, how do they change over time? What do you see? And can you see lifestyle changes on the brain, like constant stress or constant anxiety and pressure?
Yes and no. When you operate on a child, everything's just pristine. It's just, it hasn't been altered at all by life. When you operate on an adult, well, one of the biggest differences is the skull is a lot thicker. Actually, their heads are not a heck of a lot bigger than, say a 2 or 3-year-old child, because most of the head growth occurs in the first 2 years. But it does everything just feels more pristine in a child. Really, in terms of chronic stress and that sort of thing, you may not see much difference. More like when you abuse your brain. So chronic alcoholism, for example,
Okay.
or, just long-term cigarettes, anything that really takes a chronic
Drugs, yeah.
physical toll, the brain will look more shrunken, just less, I don't know, again, pristine, less viable, if you will.
What can you do as a person to take care of your brain? I mean, the human brain is 100,000 years old. It's not designed to work in this time, with this constant stress, this constant information overload, constant anxiety. We are built to survive in the old age, where we dealt with dangerous creatures, and now we're dealing, we don't have dangerous creatures anymore, but we have other things which are probably more challenging for us as a human being and for our brains. So what kind of impact does it have? And then what can we do to take care of ourselves and our brains?
Yeah, you're making a great point in that I think one of the biggest challenges to brains is simply age. We know that's the strongest correlation with dementia and all, is just, if you get really old, your brain is not going to be what it once was, because, as you say, maybe the grand majority of us didn't make it out of our 40s and, or even before then. But we can do a lot to try to, help keep our brains in as good a function as possible through the years. Now, going back to what I just said, one of the challenges is you don't make a lot of new brain cells, neurons. You kind of have a certain amount of neurons, billions and billions, close to 100 billion. But you do lose them over time. And there's some areas of the brain that can make some new nerve cells, but for the most part, you don't replace them. So, all of us are losing some no matter what happens. But what we've seen that correlates well in terms of trying to preserve our brain functions are a few things. One, obviously, is to take care of them. So, Smoking's probably way up there as one of the worst ones. Long-term high blood pressure, long-term atherosclerotic disease, high cholesterol, that sort of thing is going to result in damage to the brain. And we'll see all sorts of tiny strokes across the brain, even if you haven't had a big stroke. Multiple trauma to the head is not good, so there's all this discussion, certainly in America, about football and all, and American football.
I spent a couple of months in New Zealand and they're playing rugby without any protection. Yeah, and I thought, oh my God.
Yeah, I played rugby in college and I had my share of concussions, but so hopefully I didn't do too much damage. But so beyond, staying in decent health and staying away from the stuff that we know really causes damage, what we can do, well, it does seem that good nutrition, not fancy fad diets or anything like that, but just staying on top of decent nutrition, having a well-balanced dinner and that sort of thing, plenty of fruits and vegetables will help us. I think just keeping our bodies healthy. So there's a good correlation with, it doesn't have to be extreme sports or extreme exercise, but keeping our bodies in decent shape is definitely a plus as well. And then you get into kind of more how you use your brain. One of the stronger correlates to developing dementia is a reduction in person-to-person contact, is really reducing your social world. And we see this a lot, for example, in middle-aged men whose friend network shrinks down to nearly nothing. And yet we know that the more you stay engaged, the more you are interacting with people of all sorts and all times and conversations and all, that's a strong correlate to preserving your brain. Likewise, it turns out that hearing loss is a strong correlate with dementia. And it's probably related to the socialization side. If you're not hearing things, it's hard to,
communicate.
Yeah. And so, getting
Mm-hmm.
hearing aids if you need them is definitely a good thing. And then another big one is to keep our brains active and engaged. What that means is, even if you're 80, there's no reason why you can't be learning a new language or reading history books or watching documentaries. Just keep the brain engaged, keep learning, keep it going, and it is more likely to function better over time.
Yeah, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting that loneliness affects your brain
Yes.
that much. And why is it that middle-aged men lose all their friends? I mean, I came across this a couple of times. But why do you think this is the case?
I haven't studied that aspect other than being once a middle-aged man. I'm not sure I can claim that anymore, but I think we get so immersed in whatever our professional
What we do.
identities are.
Yeah.
And it got to be got to reach the top, got to be the best, got to do. And we get so immersed in that. I think it's very easy to start losing track of your friends, even your family. And, it's seductive because if you really pour yourself into your worlds, usually, you're going to see some benefit from it. And people are singing your accolades. And next thing you know it, you're, chief of a neurosurgery department. And, you're thinking, I'm a big wig. And yet you've,
it's society.
Yeah.
Society is basically, it doesn't demand it from you, but it conditions you as an individual to basically go this route, make a career, and then you get your satisfaction from the career and you don't realize that you're losing contact with your friends. But there will come the point where you maybe are not so involved in your career anymore, and then you see, oh, there's nothing much left.
Yeah, exactly. And, it goes one step beyond even, I think, in a lot of scenarios, Sebastian, that I certainly saw it a lot in medicine. But anytime I talk to people in other industries, it's the same thing. When you start getting, into that high production, high intensity field, no matter what it is, there also seems to be this kind of delight in suffering. We call it a suffering contest.
Yeah.
I got in, an hour before anybody and I leave an hour after everybody. I did the most output of everybody on the team.
I'm so busy,
Exactly. I never go home.
Yeah.
I never see my family.
Oh, great.
It's like
Yes.
we're trying to-
Get a life.
it's like we're trying to top each other. And I don't know if it's, that is kind of a male macho thing, isn't it? When you think about it, I gotta be tougher than the guy next to me.
Yeah, it's part of our society, And I recently met an old friend, and he's also very a successful CEO. And the first thing is, I'm so busy, and I have this and that. I said, okay, I mean, nice, but what about your life? What about yourself?
As you're pointing out, it is very culturally rewarded, right? When you're in a workplace and somebody says, look at Joe, he works 14 hours a day, and everybody's going, whoa, that guy is something. You would hope that we would reverse it and say, look at Joe. He gets home and sees his family for dinner, 4 nights a week. So we celebrate sometimes the wrong things.
We don't realize what impact it has. And it's very interesting to learn that it really has basically a physical impact on your brain, that it's changing and it leaves traces. So when you've done this many times, is it to a certain extent reversible, or is it enough to use it, to train it, to work on doing some intense studies to regain elasticity or power in the brain?
You're making a good point, and it all ties in. I think it all wraps itself into knits itself into a nice tapestry, if you will, or something. And I'm going to go back a little bit. We're going to go into neuroscience a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yes, please. It's highly interesting.
But I think a lot of people see a brain as pretty much like a computer, that you've got a bunch of wires that are all connected and they fire between each other, all these little channels fire, and the wires talk to each other. And somehow whatever computers can do and whatever our brains can do comes out of that. Okay. And you can get into deep discussions on how we do anything with that setup. But anyway, I think a lot of people think that the brain's just like a computer, in that in a factory, you make sure all these wires connect, and that's the computer you're given. And that's the computer you'll have. You can put all sorts of software into it, like our learning and teaching, but you're still pretty much hardwired for,
you can't upgrade your hardware. You can't get the next shiny MacBook.
Or you got to buy a new computer, right? Which we can't do. But the reality is, it's not that at all. That the nervous system, that the brain is constantly remodeling, like all the time, constantly. You don't see it on the big scope. So there are, our basic structure between you and I, between everybody, is similar. Our pathways, the big pathways, are pretty similar. But what's happening when you start focusing down to the individual neurons and to the individual places where one neuron communicates with the next neuron, we call them synapses, but where one neuron talks to the next neuron, it does so by releasing little chemicals, what we call neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, that sort of thing, which we've all heard of. And you release them from one cell and it goes to the other cell and it gets picked up there and sets up an electrical charge in the next neuron. And that communication, that connection, is always in flux. Sometimes you're making new connections, sometimes you're getting rid of some connections, but even with the connections that are staying there, the amount of chemical you release, how quickly the chemical gets gobbled up, how many receptors there are for that chemical, how many things receiving that chemical, is constantly being changed. And it's being changed by all our experiences in life. What are we seeing? What are we feeling? What are we, what interactions are we having? What stresses have we been subjected to? And that is always changing. And even down to, the genes that regulate this sort of stuff. You'll turn on certain genes and turn off certain genes depending on what's going on that individual level. So if you bring it up to a more macro level, theoretically at least, and there's good scientific evidence for this, you can change the communication and the weight we put on certain circuits in our brain. So best studied are things like chronic stress and depression, but with chronic stress and depression, various areas in our brain, reward systems in the brain, the things that make us happy, start down regulating. They even shrink. they stop communicating as much, and we put more emphasis on our survival parts of our brain that are saying, you are under stress, you must be, you must be at risk, you better be more fearful, you better be more anxious, because that's how we keep, historically, that's how we keep our brain alive. So we can definitely deteriorate it.
Stress causes anxiety and fear.
Sure. That there's an area of the brain called the amygdala that attaches emotions, and particularly the fear and anxiety stuff. And that actually gets bigger in people who have been subjected to chronic or severe stress.
So in the end, we control what we let into our brains in terms of accepting stress, or reading the news. I mean, I have a very interesting experience I made. I spent a couple of months in New Zealand, and I hardly watched news there. And it's a very remote country, and the news, they don't show anything from the rest of the world. And I stepped away from Europe news for a while. But then, of course, I mean, there comes the situation, you pull out your phone, you look at the news page, and I could feel the anxiety rising in my body just looking at these headlines. I'm looking at the headlines about the war and in Ukraine and everything that's going on. And I really felt, shit, what impact does it have on me? And I just did it once and stayed away from it for a long time. We live in a world where we constantly bombarded with all this negativity. You can't escape seeing headlines when you walk down the street and looking at a newspaper, or you open a browser, or you see some stuff on social media. So we are constantly bombarded with negativity, stressing us, raising our anxiety level. Yeah? And what we learned, this has an impact on our brain and how it's changing over time.
The point is super well taken. We are literally strengthening up our stress networks in the brain. So it's almost like it becomes even easier for you to pick up on the negativity. And we see that in our behaviors, right? People, once they kind of get into that, it seems like they can't even break out. They just spend all the time
They're addicted.
feeding that
addicted
to themselves. Yeah. And, obviously we're all subjected to modern media, which, the news cycle is constant. It never stops. And they don't broadcast good news. I mean, what interests people is disaster and tragedy and stuff like that.
Exactly.
So yeah, we subject ourselves to this stuff at volumes that human beings never used to even experience, right? I mean, that's not how they functioned back in those days.
Even a few decades ago, it was much, much different. It just has accumulated in the last years. I mean, I grew up in East Germany. As an adult, when you fought against the system, then it was not. But as a child, I felt protected. There was nothing really happening. We had 2 news channels, didn't even have a phone at home, a landline at home, So, I mean, not talking about mobile connections and always on mentality. When I see how my kids nowadays have to navigate through this world, with everything which is going on, the constant bombardment with information and everything. I mean, it's such a difference how I have been grown up and how they grow up nowadays.
Similar experience in some ways back during the Vietnam War, for example. You would turn on the news, but it was at 7 p.m. to get the national news. So you would turn on the news, and it was
one time a day.
It was half an hour long, the news, and they might lead off with a little bit of news of what's going on in Vietnam. And that's all you heard about Vietnam that day. Whereas if that was going on now, there would be on-the-ground reporters everywhere. Every minute of the news cycle, they would be giving, reports of this battle and these deaths and these injuries. And, a certain amount of exposure is probably important for a democratic society, but to be just constantly hit with very stressful things, it's just going to compound. We already all have complicated lives, right? The modern world is multitasking to the nth degree. We got a million things to worry about already. And then you're worrying about, fascism taking over your country and this and that. And, so you're just adding fuel to the fire.
You wrote a book about burnout, which basically really fed by this topic. And so what are your learnings and what is the content of this book? Why is burnout such an issue nowadays? And what can you do against it?
We actually ended up writing 3 books. It's all related to the healthcare world, but I think, what we talk about in the healthcare world is very applicable to, everything else in our modern society. Again, just we live in a mile a minute society. Everything's going at once. There's a million inputs, and you've got to sort through all this. So burnout is going to occur when people are subjected to very high demand situations and they have low control. So you're all these demands on you, all these stressors, but you can't really do much about it. And that's, and it tends to be more common in people who are highly motivated, bright, hardworking. You're just describing our modern society. This is what we do. Expected to do a lot all the time, nonstop, always seeking to do more or better than, the competition. And yet you may have very little actual control over what happens. And so there is this state of constant stress related to your work. And, you can have burnout at home too, but we could discuss that on another
business. Yeah.
So I think probably the best metaphor that I've heard for burnout, keeping in perspective, this modern world that we're all inhabiting, because I think that's why it's more obvious. Although I would argue that it was always around, and we can talk about that in a second. But I think the best metaphor that I've heard is that we all kind of carry within us a bank of energy, if you will, a psychic or emotional bank, whatever you want to call it. But it's that energy that gets us up out of bed, gets us into the car, goes to work, takes care of the house, takes care of whatever needs to be done, your day-to-day life. You need a certain amount of energy to do that. And yet everything we do, everything we experience either makes a deposit in that bank, actually energizes us, or for me, if Manchester United wins, I feel more energized, right? Or it depletes some of the energy, makes a withdrawal. And we all can think of many things that make a withdrawal, like when the mother-in-law comes to visit for a while.
Many energy vampires.
But so, one good way to look at it is burnout would be a state, not necessarily permanent or anything like that. And I think we all dip in and out of it, but it's a situation where you're overdrawn. You've taken out so much energy that even the things that make you feel good, that make you feel energized, aren't getting you there. And therefore, everything becomes an effort. And going back to, was burnout here before recently? I would say, it's always been around. I think what we often see with burnout doesn't fit the perfect definitions. But what I certainly saw a lot of was when that energy level gets low enough, all our own personal idiosyncrasies start to come out. And we start behaving in ways that we wouldn't want to behave, or that, it doesn't feel like us. So, and everybody's a little different, right? So I have a really kind of sarcastic inner voice, but I try to keep that in because I've learned that sarcasm often hurts feelings, and I don't ever want to hurt feelings. But if I'm really depleted, boy, that sarcasm comes right to the surface, and it's out of my mouth before, I have a chance to control it. So, in the neurosurgical sphere, for example, what we noticed was when we felt that burnout was, pretty strong on a team, the team might still be performing very well, just like we talked about earlier, even with lost sleep and all that sort of stuff. You can do surgery, you can take good care of people, but boy, they are offending everybody in the hospital, snapping, yelling, being sarcastic, overly demanding. So certain personality quirks and bad behaviors start coming out. And we've seen that forever, in modern times at least.
From a medical point of view, can you measure burnout, or do you see changes in the body Are there ways to diagnostic burnout apart from basically seeing the state of the person and realizing that he's or she is low of energy?
Yes and no would be one way to answer it. I think the easiest way, once you start thinking about it, frankly, is just to look at the behavior of people around you. And it becomes relatively easy to say, hey, they're not the person they normally are. And a lot of people, they will start acting out and being kind of more temperamental and that sort of thing. And my co-author, who's a world expert on burnout, but my co-author, I once asked him, I said, how many of these people that are having, these sort of troubles are truly burned out, or are we kind of putting a label on people who are just jerks, who are just not nice people? And his experience, and he had treated thousands of people, he said his experience was that, at most 5% are jerks. So the rest are just good people who have had this state of low energy and then are acting out from it. You can do, formal psychological assays and pick up on that. But I think you're going to see it more in body language and behavior. Now, if you get to the neuroscience side of this neuroscience is relatively limited thus far. It's really just starting to come in at looking at people who have high burnout indexes and looking at their brains with functional MRIs and that sort of thing. So it looks like it's going to mimic depression, and that's not a surprise because if you have burnout, you're at much higher risk for depression. But it's hard to do like animal studies. They have very well established depression studies for animals. Right now, we don't know how to mimic burnout in an animal, if you will. So, when you get to the true physical manifestations, we're hypothesizing, but we don't know for sure.
I have a friend, and in my opinion, close to a burnout. She's working day and night, and the issue is she's not receptive for help. She said, I have to work. She's 3 years to retirement. She said, I have to finish these 3 years, then my life will change. And I think, oh my God, if you carry on like this for 3 years, your life will really change, but to the worse, because, you have no life left and you will fall in such a hole because you don't have this identification anymore you have at the moment with your job. This person is so tired that she's not even going out after 8 in the evening. And it's impossible to reach them. It's impossible to talk to them. They're so in the tunnel, but you can really see from month to month, they're changing, They're losing energy, they're putting on weight, they're looking unhealthier and unhealthier. And it's very hard when you see someone doing so much harm to themselves, they're not open for anything.
I think that's, part of the challenge that we certainly noticed. And I can always make it sound like it's other people, but, I've certainly been through my share. So, and that's the thing. It's not black and white. You're not burned out and then you're burned out forever. It's that I think that, if you use that energy metaphor, you just slip into the super low energy periodically and you may be able to climb out and then you may go back down. And it may even in a day, you may be cycling around, if you're really close to the line, if you will. But I think it's really hard when you're in it to actually recognize it. It's really hard. And as a matter of fact, we tend to then start blaming other things. The administration is driving me crazy. These rules are driving me crazy. This is driving me crazy.
They're always the other ones who are in charge. Yeah.
But it seems to be, to me, a trait that it is hard to recognize in yourself. And I think it goes back to the energy thing. It takes energy to look at yourself and say, whoa, that you're not the person you want to be, or you're not the person you were 2 years ago.
Self-reflection.
What's going on? But that takes upfront energy. And that, unfortunately, a lot of ways to tackle burnout takes a couple of steps of upfront energy. You've got to put some effort into it. Somebody can't give you a pill. Somebody's not going to say, wave a wand and all of a sudden you're out of burnout. You have, we see the way to tackle burnout is to build our personal resilience, really work on our resilience, really work on our wellness. And that's going to fill up the energy stores. So even when you hit bad things, it won't empty you out. But that's hard to do up,
And it's a conscious process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a conscious decision you have to make. I want to work on my resilience. I want to spend time away, and I want to switch off, and I want to do some wellness for myself, for my mind and my body. But it's a conscious decision. And if you don't make this decision, then you are in this rat hole, in this rat race. And
I'll tell you, Sebastian, with our own experience, it started with, I was the boss. It started with my neurosurgical team, which was a big team, a lot of surgeons, residents, physician assistants. We had a big team, and we were getting in trouble all over the hospital system, just not for bad care. I think our care was superlative, but we were being jerks. We were not being nice to the people around us. And, I eventually stumbled on the concept that this could be that we're all burning out. And I happened to meet a world expert. His name is Wayne Sotil. And we started working together on this. But initially what we did was we had weekly, what we called resilience building sessions with my entire team. And they were all cynical and nobody wanted to come. But I was the boss. And that's what, I was, at least in that scenario, able to say, you will come and, just sit there if you don't want to. But what was fascinating to me, because neurosurgeons tend to be very cynical and very hard people. It's a hard world that we inhabit. But within a few months of doing this, I no longer had to tell people to go. They were all coming voluntarily. And they began sharing things, very intimate about their lives and about their worries and their fears and the things that were bringing them down and the things that were making them, bringing them joy. And so, it's that initial step, I think, sometimes, because once you start feeling it, infuse, you start feeling better. So I'll give you just a real quick example, because we have, 50, 70 strategies that we encourage in people to try. And we find that one thing may work for one person, but doesn't work for the next. One thing helps. And the example I always give is meditation. They're always saying, meditation and mindfulness. It doesn't do a thing for me. I don't even think I can do it. It just doesn't work. My mind, it wanders all over the place and it never works for me. But one of the things that we do that I think demonstrates everything that we've talked about so far is this simple exercise. And that is, for 2 to 3 weeks, force yourself. You have to make yourself do it, but force yourself every day in your day-to-day goings on. Take out a piece of paper or, use your phone, but look for 5 things that went well or, put a smile on your face or made you happy. Just 5 things, but you got to look for them. You got to find them and write them down. And then at night, before you go to bed, you look at them and you say, okay, these things happened today. I know a lot of other stuff happened today, but these decent things happened. And what you find is, if you do that, if you make yourself do it for 2 to 3 weeks, you don't have to make yourself do it anymore. Your brain is already trained on it. And it's noticing, hey, that person smiled at me.
It's a habit.
Hey, that person thanked me. And your world then takes a different color.
We take things so granted. We're not appreciating the small things in life anymore. You always expect the big success or the big thing to happen for us. And we wait, and it never comes.
Right.
But in the meantime, all these small things are happening, like having this amazing conversation with you today. Yeah?
Right.
And we just don't realize, you don't recognize this. And I used to write a gratitude journal. I sort of stopped, but I will pick this up again.
That's good.
That's definitely a very rewarding exercise. And thanks for sharing that.
Sebastian, that's a funny one too. As an example, one of our suggestions for people is journaling. Because a lot of times, the better you know yourself, the better you explore your emotions, particularly if you look at how you're responding to your world. One of the things that a flip side to this, for example, is we suggest that periodically, if you've got some trusted people that you can sit and discuss with, it's good to what we call debrief your stressors. Talk about some of the things that are really bothering you. But what we don't want is for you to sit down and just complain. What we want is for you to sit down and say, how did I react to that stressor? Is there a different way? Is there a way that would bring me energy instead of sucking the energy right out of me? And, I think even with journaling, you could fall in that trap. If if in the journal, all you're doing is complaining, as opposed to kind of looking at yourself and say, hey, this made me feel good. I think maybe I need to do more of this or whatever. But anyway, so this was one of our 70 strategies that we tried. And I have to admit, I experimented on my team with all 70 over years. But so I said, yeah, we're going to do journal. I usually would set them up for 2 weeks at a time. We're going to do this time, and we're going to do this time, and then just see how people responded. But so I bought them all these pretty leather-bound journals and, with a little leather ties to it and stuff like that. Not one of them did it. They just
Gary again. Yeah.
So again, what works for Peter doesn't work for Paul. But if you find that journaling made you feel better, that's fantastic. You already have one of your answers. I should do that a little more.
Very good. I have to definitely get a copy of your book and maybe a couple of copies and give it out to some friends who need these strategies to get over certain circumstances.
Yeah, well, thanks. They are medically oriented. I think the best one is called The Thriving Physician, but they are medically oriented. But people in other industries tell me, this all works fine for us. Yeah, we're not in a trauma bay putting in IVs, but otherwise, the stressors you talk about are pretty universal.
You also wrote a book, a thriller, just recently.
Yeah.
About a neurosurgeon.
Go figure.
What made you write a thriller?
Well, it kind of ties into a lot of what we've been talking about. I think, a bunch of themes in my life, I think kind of intersected, but originally I just wanted to write a eyes wide open, this is what the modern neurosurgery world looks like. Because I don't think people have, much sense of just how intense modern medicine is, behind the doors. And so I wanted to kind of reflect what the physicians were doing, what, the people who helped them were, how patients ended up the way they ended up. I really wanted to also get out there, just how fragile life is and how we need to celebrate it while we have it and that sort of thing. But anyway, it was coming out too boring. It was, felt like a book report. So I decided to switch to fiction, and I played around with a lot of ideas. And then I started thinking, well, why not go with what I know and do a brain surgeon who's clearly already burned out. He's, already overworked, and he's overworking himself though, he's a workaholic and tired and beat up, but he begins to see things that originally he thinks are hallucinations. And then he starts believing that they're ghosts. And he sees more and more, and it really begins to really interfere with his life. And, and we take it from there. So it really touches on, a lot of the themes that we're talking about today, but also life and death and why ghosts. Well, I started thinking about how often in my existence, at least, I saw people go from life to death. I mean, I was around people dying all the time. And it has an impact. There's no two ways about it. And I said, well, I could play with that idea that if you're a ghost and you're trying to reach someone over on our side, the living side, maybe a neurosurgeon seems pretty familiar because they're always hanging around. So that's how I got into that.
Interesting. So a lot to read from you. And I have to re-listen to this episode a couple of times to take in all these gold nuggets you shared.
We'll see how gold they are once you re-listen.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Oh, it's a sheer pleasure speaking with you. I love the questions that you're asking. And I think coming from a medical person, maybe somebody's going to listen and say, well, that's not my world. But the reality is we're all experiencing this crazy world right now.
Exactly. And we're all trying things out and we're all learning.
Yeah? Right.
Everyone is learning. And if you have the right mindset, the right growth mindset to take on new ideas and develop yourself, then you can learn from any conversation.
Well, and one of the points that we make, Sebastian, is that it seems that, at least currently in our mindsets, we don't grant ourselves a lot of permission to know ourselves and to take care of ourselves. So we call it self-compassion and self-care, to the point, and I don't know if you've been through this, I certainly have been through it a lot in my life, but that is feeling guilty if I take a few moments to look after myself.
Yeah, to rest, to enjoy yourself. I think many achievers have gone through these emotions and these thoughts, but we have to take care of ourselves. We only have one body. We only have one brain. Yeah. And I learned that input from the outside will alter my brain. So you have to stand guard and only try to primarily let positive things into your brain and not all this garbage. I mean, from the IT world, garbage in, garbage out. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I really enjoyed speaking with you, and you are definitely not a jerk. Yeah, I mean, you're an amazing person to talk with, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you so much for sharing everything. And yeah, I'm looking forward to have a look at your books.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure, and I wish I was skiing.
Thank you for tuning into the High Performance CEO Show. I'm your host, Sebastian Schieke, and it's been a pleasure serving you. Please subscribe to our show on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create a bigger impact. Check out our website, sebastianschieke.com, for additional resources. Until next time, be bold, be exceptional, be outstanding, be a leader.